Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Vespers, a time when we pause in the busyness of our weeks to just spend a little bit of time with God, to connect with God, to take a little bit of an inventory of our lives and figure out what it would look like to take one step closer to Jesus. And today, we're going to be talking about what it looks like to help others who are in need. So as we get started today, let me throw a question up there. Can you think of a time here, maybe in the last few weeks or months, when you have received help from someone? Or maybe a time when you helped someone who was in need. I wonder, when you think about that situation, how did God bless you through it? I'd also put this question out there for you as well today as we get started. Do you usually notice those who are in need around you? What is your typical reaction or response when you see someone in need? Whether it's a stranger on a street corner, or maybe it's a friend or a family member. Maybe it's a family member who is oftentimes asking for help. I mean, what are those things, those triggers in your life where it just causes you to push back, or what causes you to respond to those who are in need? Today I'd like for us to talk about how, not only what it looks like to help those in need, but also because Vespers is a time when we're considering how our lives and our relationship with God interplay with each other. I want to talk with you a little bit about maybe how our view of helping those in need perhaps impacts our relationships with God himself. Now, if the words that God has spoken to us in the Bible are any indication of how he feels about this, then this is a topic that is big on God's heart. Let me share with you a passage today from Isaiah chapter 58. Notice these words. God says to us, I want you to share your food with the hungry. I want you to find the poor who don't have homes and bring them into your homes. Think about that one. Then God says, when you see people who have no clothes, give them your clothes. Don't hide from your relatives when they need help. So it's not even just talking about strangers. It's also talking about the people that we know in our lives as well. And then notice how the passage ends. It says, if you do these things, your light will begin to shine like the light of dawn. Then your wounds will heal. Your goodness will walk in front of you, and the glory of the Lord will come following behind you. And then notice this verse. This is really key here today. Then you will call to the Lord, and he will answer you. You will cry out to him, and he will say, here I am. Now you might say, Dave, well, that's kind of an isolated passage, but hang on a minute. There are so many places in both the Old Testament and the New Testament when God addresses us, it really speaks to our hearts about this issue about helping those in need. In Deuteronomy 15, it says the exact same thing as I just read to you. And in that passage, God says, do not harden your hearts. In James chapter 2, James warns us about not being one of those people who see others in need and then wish them well, or maybe say, I'll pray for you, but do nothing about it. Psalm 41 says that we are blessed when we consider the poor. And when we go through troubles of our own, because we consider the poor, it says God delivers us. Jeremiah 22 says, you help the poor and the needy, and God will make sure things go well with you. And then in Luke 6, I was just reading this yesterday. Jesus says, you cannot outgive God. When you reach out to my kids in the world and other places in the world who have a need, and you do something about it, I will always make sure you are cared for as well. But I selected this passage today. Of all the passages I just kind of thumbed through, I selected the one in Isaiah 58 for a reason. I mean, look at those words there. When God tells us to meet those who are in need, he says, if you do these things, your light will shine like the light of dawn. God's presence will be seen, will be noticeable in your life. He said, you're struggling in body or in other ways. It says God will intervene and step in. And at the end there in verse 9, he says, when you call out to the Lord yourself, God will answer. And he will say, here I am. How many of us at times have struggled with wondering, does God hear me and what I'm going through, what I'm saying to him? Well, sometimes there are other factors going in our lives, but it's made me think as I was reflecting on this passage today, I wonder if there are any times in my life when maybe I'm not hearing God or God's not responding to me because of something else that's going on in my life that's hindering me from hearing God. Maybe even the way I look at his other kids in other places in the community or even in the world when he asks me to respond to them. We as Americans, I think of many of the things that we see in the Bible, this is one of the things we struggle with the most. This idea of giving up the resources we have to someone else who is in need. I mean, this isn't just a rich or poor issue. This isn't even just a Democrat or Republican issue. Democrats want the government to take care of the poor oftentimes, and Republicans want nonprofits to do it. But when it comes to how we live ourselves, it doesn't matter what party label you're wearing, we can all be selfish and struggle at times when it comes to giving of our own resources, whether it is a family member or a friend or a stranger. It's easy for us to say to ourselves in those moments, I'm really busy today. Someone else can take care of that another time. Or maybe to say, you know what? They don't really need it. They just need to work, or they need to learn how to manage their money better or whatever. It's easy for us in those moments to just make a quick judgmental statement about someone and not take the time to pause and say, Christ, what are you saying to me in this moment? I tell you, I confess how I'm feeling about this right now, and maybe sharing that with God. But God, I want to take a moment to hear what you would have to say to me before I'll continue walking on. Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. 2,000 years ago, he told that story to people who seemed to be religious people, but who struggled with taking care of the needy. And he gave this example in the story of the Good Samaritan about all these people who were so busy, or they felt like they were so important that they couldn't be bothered with someone who was beaten and lying in the side of the road. Sometimes the needs we see are so present, we all want to jump in and do something about it. I mean, I don't think there are many of us who would see someone who is beaten up on the side of the road and do nothing. But what about that person who looks like they're homeless and looks like they haven't had a meal in a while? How do we respond in those moments? And I tell you, I'm not casting judgment here. I'm pouring a lot of this on myself because I struggle with this. I have for many, many years. I remember 25 years ago when I was in seminary, I used to ride to seminary. We sometimes would carpool with another person in my class. And it seemed like no matter what route we took to get to the seminary, there was always somebody that this guy saw that he felt like we needed to pull over on the side of the road and help. And I remember I used to get so irritated with this guy. I'm like, oh my gosh, did you see what time it is? We need to be in class on time. Or I was like, do you have to stop every time you see somebody in need? But I was, of course, in seminary at the time. And I was like, I can't say that because that wouldn't be appropriate. So I would just kind of smile and grit my teeth. I'm like, come on, let's go. Let's get this done. And I kind of had that mentality for a long time. Got a lot to do. God, surely, and I throw up a quick prayer. God, I pray you'll take care of them. And then God really nailed me in the heart about 3 or 4 years ago. I was actually on sabbatical in Europe with my family. And my son, who was 16 at the time, he seemed to find every need that there was in Italy or in Spain, wherever we were at the time. He would, in fact, when we would land in either one of these countries, he would want to go to a dollar store because he wanted to be able to buy flip-flops and water bottles and granola bars and a few other things to be able to hand out in case he saw someone in need. And I kept thinking, dude, you're spending a lot of my money. We were spending like $100, $150 at the time for him to go and grab all these things and fill a backpack with him. He wanted to even buy backpacks to be able to use. And I was struggling with that. And then we would be in the middle of going somewhere. We'd be on a tour or something, and he'd want to stop because he saw somebody else in need. And I'm like, oh my goodness, son, we have so much to do. I'll never forget, there was one time we were in Spain, and he ran into a homeless man on a park bench. And as soon as I saw the guy, my first thought was, maybe if I kind of redirect us in another direction. Isaac won't see this person. And I thought, no, David, what are you saying? So we continue walking down this path. And of course, my son saw this man and starts carrying on a conversation with him in Spanish because he's very fluent in Spanish, and starts connecting with this guy. And would you know, he wants to rededicate his life to Christ right there on the spot. And I was really touched in that moment. I thought, you know what, my son gets it and I don't. Then there was another time later in that vacation that sabbatical when we were in Italy. And I'll never forget it. We were just coming out of this, we were just getting ready to go into this big, beautiful basilica that was there. And, we were standing right in front of a statue of St. Francis of Assisi, of all people. And my son sees someone else. It was a kid who appeared to be lame. And Isaac wanted to help. And I'm like, okay, let's help. And then after we came out of the basilica, the kid didn't actually see us, and he was standing and he was carrying a conversation. He was kind of laughing about those he's been able to get money from that day. And I remember looking at my son and thinking, well, that's going to do it. And he looked back at me and said, Dad, it doesn't matter. He says, this isn't about what I'm doing for them. It's about what I'm doing for him. That got me. That was when I realized how hardened my heart had gotten. And I had a lot to learn from him. On that trip, we learned a lot about this guy named Francis of Assisi who lived in the Middle Ages in Italy. And he was born to a wealthy family, and he had all this opulence. He had all this stuff in his life, and he had no need to pay attention to others who weren't as well off as he was. But there came a point in his early adult life where he walked away from all of it because he just felt convicted of God. And there's this one story that we learned when we were on sabbatical of Francis, when he was riding a horse out in the countryside, and he runs up upon a leper. And in that moment, he writes that he was repulsed by what he saw, with the sores and everything else, and everything in him just wanted to run the other way. But what we see in that story is that he actually ran to the leper, fighting his own feelings inside, the horror, the disgust he felt, and he gave him money, and he actually embraced this man. And then in Francis's writings, he says he started to leave, but then he turned back to say goodbye, and all of a sudden, this leper had disappeared, and he realized there's nowhere this leper could have gone. And he realized, I think I just saw Jesus. Hebrews 12 talks about this. It says that sometimes God actually tests us. In those moments, it says we might be entertaining angels and we don't even know it. Now you might say, Dave, does that mean that we're just that we're sinning if we don't respond to every single need that we see? No, I don't think that's the case. But what I've been dealing with in my own life since my son so impressed this on my heart years ago is this: if my heart is so calloused that I don't care enough to even ask God in that moment how he wants me to respond, then aren't I neglecting the poor? Aren't I breaking God's heart? Should I at least stop and ask God, is this something you want me to do something about today? I think about something that Mother Teresa once said many years ago before she died. One of Mother Teresa's admirers asked her one time, they said, how can you keep serving the poor and the sick and the dying with such vigor? What's your secret, Mother Teresa? How do you do it? And her answer was surprising but profound. She said this. She says, whenever I meet someone in need, it's really Jesus in his most distressing disguise. It's Jesus in his most distressing disguise. Let me ask you today, what's Christ's most distressing disguise for you? Is it a drug addict panhandling on the street corner? Is it a leper? Is it a family member who seems to always be in trouble and always has his hand out for help? Well, as we spend our time today, I just thought I'd check in with you guys, see if there was any feedback that you wanted to give or any questions. I don't see any that might be worthwhile sharing today. I see one person here is agreeing with me. You're struggling with this whole idea of working so many jobs, of having to take care of someone else on the street who's maybe not doing their fair share. I get it. I think those thoughts all the time. And I have just keep reminding myself of those words that my son said to me in front of that St. Francis statue. It isn't about them, it's about him. And asking myself, God, help me deal with those feelings because they are real. And maybe sometimes we're not supposed to do something in certain situations. But I get it. I totally get what you're saying. Well, let me wrap up our time today by sharing with you a passage from Matthew 25. And this will be our prayer today as we wrap up our time. I just want to encourage you, maybe close your eyes, take a moment and just allow these words to wash over you. Maybe you even can picture yourself in this passage in Matthew 25. Maybe you can see yourself one day in heaven, and maybe God will be saying these words to you. Matthew 25:34 says, and following says this, "Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me into your home. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you cared for me. I was in prison, and you visited me.' Then these righteous ones will reply, 'Lord, when did we ever see you hungry or feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink, or a stranger and show you hospitality, or naked and give you clothing? When did we ever see you sick or in prison and visit you?' And the king will say, 'I tell you the truth. When you did this for the least of these, my brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me.'" Well, I pray that this has been a blessing to you today. I pray that this has spoken to you. As I wrap up today, a quick shout out to those of you who will be involved with our virtual missions trip here at the end of the week. For those of you who don't know about it, here at OVCN, we're going to be hosting a virtual missions trip to Haiti Saturday night, March 6th at 7 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Pastor Craig and I will be facilitating a conversation, and we'll be talking about what we can do to take care of some of the needs of starving children in other parts of the world where where COVID-19 has just devastated certain populations, like in Haiti and in the Philippines. So we're going to actually take a virtual missions trip to Haiti and find out what's happening on the ground and be able to share with you how we can all come together in Tucson. And so those of you watching in other parts of the country can tune in as well, and we can do something to make a difference in some kids' lives this year. Well, thanks again for joining us. Hope you have a great rest of your week. I'll talk to you soon. God bless. Bye-bye.